I accidentally got entangled with my supposed Uncle Smith for a night. I heard that he never talks about love or gives women a status. He never touches the same woman twice. But we maintained a hidden relationship for a whole half year. Until one day, Smith's mom joyfully showed me a photo. Smith's chosen fiancée, isn't she beautiful? I looked at that stunning woman, smiled and blessed them. Very beautiful, very compatible, congratulations Uncle Smith. Late at night, Smith suddenly came to my room, showing off his skills. Vivian, calling me husband in bed, but uncle under the bed, are you playing with me? As I dragged my sore body downstairs, Smith was sitting at the dining table. He didn't wear his tie, his collar loose, revealing the bite mark on his collarbone. My legs went weak, almost losing my balance, and I quickly grabbed the railing to steady myself. Smith glanced at me and spoke in his usual mild tone, take your time coming downstairs. Okay, got it. He didn't say anything else, bowing his head to continue eating. I watched his slender fingers holding the knife and fork, cutting into the food on his plate. The joints were distinct, clean and powerful. Gradually, my cheeks felt hot. It was just last night, these hands that were so skilled with a scalpel. That had delved into territories I had never explored before. Bringing me ultimate pleasure time and time again. I didn't go to the dining table, instead, I bypassed it and went to the kitchen. I grabbed an egg and a carton of milk, ready to leave. Vivian. Smith suddenly called out to me. I instinctively stopped and turned around. He had already stood up, taking the coat handed to him by the servant. By the way, I'll drop you off today. No need, I'll take the subway. Smith said nothing, just looked down at me from a high vantage point. My gaze fell on the tooth mark on his collarbone, and I immediately looked away in a fluster, feeling as if I had been scalded. Today, I chose not to take the subway. Smith checked his watch and said, let's go. I was afraid he would lose patience, so I didn't insist any further. As a surgeon, Smith has always been a bit of a neat freak. I dared not eat anything in his car, so I stuffed the eggs and milk into my backpack. When I got in the car just now, it felt like I had aggravated a torn wound, and sitting on the seat made my body feel stiff and uncomfortable. Smith seemed to notice this, as he closed the tablet and lowered the partition inside the car. As we passed by a pharmacy, he bought a tube of ointment and handed it to me to apply. I hung my head, feeling my face burning hot with embarrassment. If it still hurts after applying the ointment, come to the hospital and I'll take care of it. Okay? Last night, I had a bit too much to drink and lost control, causing you harm. It's okay, Uncle Smith. I was also drunk, so it's not all your fault, I confessed. I understood Smith's implication. In his eyes, last night was just a drunken mistake. But in reality, I wasn't drunk. Instead, I deliberately let myself go off track under the influence of alcohol. Don't overthink it. Focus on your studies for now. Smith advised so that the car moved steadily forward. I sat properly in my seat. Occasionally, as we hit a bump, my leg in the short skirt would touch his trousers. He didn't move away. I discreetly shifted my body a little further away. Midway, as we passed by a pharmacy, he asked the driver to pull over. He personally went in to buy medicine for me. He followed the instructions on the manual and applied the ointment. I took the medicine and nodded obediently. When we reached near the school, I got off the car, watched it drive away, and then tossed the ointment I had been given into the trash. At noon, Smith sent me a message. Have you applied the medicine? Is it still hurting? I applied it, and it still hurts a bit. Let's observe more in the afternoon. All right. Smith didn't reply anymore. I set my phone aside, smiled softly, and bent my lips. By the afternoon, due to sweating in the heat, the torn wound started hurting badly. I skipped 2 classes, took a taxi to the hospital where Smith worked. The app showed that his appointments were fully booked. I randomly booked an appointment with another male doctor. Coincidentally, his office was next to Smith's. In less than 10 minutes, Smith messaged me. Cancel the appointment, come to my office later. But I'm almost up next. Cancelled. Fine. I cancelled the appointment and sat listlessly on the bench. It was crowded, a bit stuffy. The stinging pain in the wound became more intense. I got up to go to the restroom and noticed my face was a bit pale. There were faint pink marks on the collar of my shirt, hinting at kiss marks. There was still some swelling and pain in my chest area. I lightly touched it and couldn't help but let out a hiss. The surgical doctor had quite a strong grip. After a few more minutes, a small nurse came over and called me, "Miss Sang, Dr. Chen is asking you to come to his office now." Smith was wearing a clean white coat and had on a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He was carefully washing his hands. I watched the water flow through his slender fingers, the sound of water splashing. Suddenly, my face turned red. I lay down on the bed towards the end. I took a look at the wound. Smith glanced at me faintly and pointed to the curtain. The nurse had already closed the door and left. In the quiet room, there were only the two of us. Smith put on new rubber gloves and began to sterilize his hands seriously. I followed his instructions and walked behind the curtain. I lay down on the bed. I spread my legs apart and put them on each side of the rack. I pursed my lips, feeling a bit embarrassed as I turned my face to the wall. Slowly lifting my legs, I spread them apart. Smith's hand landed on the wound. It felt cold. I couldn't help but tremble. "Don't move. The wound seems a bit infected. Did you apply the medicine as instructed?" I nodded obediently. "I did, but it seems like it didn't work." He furrowed his brow slightly. "I'll clean the wound a bit, it might sting a little, bear with it." I bit my lip, looking pitifully at him. "Will it hurt more than last night?" Smith's gaze softened a bit. "No, it won't." "All right, that's good. Just be gentle." He didn't say anything, but his movements thereafter were gentle. "Avoid spicy food for the next few days and minimize water contact. It shouldn't be a big problem, it shouldn't hurt tomorrow." He pulled down the skirt wrapped around my waist and straightened it out. "Get up." There were still a few clear fingerprints on my thighs. Smith must have noticed them just now. I could clearly sense his breath hitched. That night, as I was about to apply the medicine after taking a shower, there was a sudden knock on the door. I quickly put on my pajamas and walked over to open the door. It was Smith standing outside. "Uncle Smith, are you looking for me?" Smith took a step forward. I had to step back. He entered the room smoothly and casually closed the door. But I just said one word. Smith had already pinched my chin and bent down to kiss me. He had just taken a shower. His scent was pleasant, and there was a cool hint of mint between his lips and teeth. I struggled a bit, but his kisses made me weak. In between breaths, I softly complained, "The wound still hurts, I know. I won't touch you tonight." Despite saying that, Smith still untied the belt of my nightgown. "It doesn't hurt anywhere else. It still hurts." I held his hand, feeling a bit aggrieved. Suddenly, Smith smiled. He picked me up and walked to the bed. "Vivian, let me hold you for a while." No, but Smith had already nestled me in his arms, closed his eyes, and said, "Don't move around, I'm very tired today." My heart instantly softened. Smith held me tighter. His face buried in the side of my neck. His breathing was calm and shallow. Like he was genuinely tired. I touched his thick hair. "Smith." I called out softly, but he didn't respond. After a while, I also gently closed my eyes. In the following days, Smith and I didn't meet much. Until Saturday, with the weather splendid. He didn't go to the hospital, but instead sat in the garden drinking tea with friends. I read for a while, then went downstairs to the garden to get some fresh air. I suddenly heard his friend mention my name. "You're almost 30 and still won't get married. Are you really still thinking about that girl from your family? Don't talk nonsense, she's still young." "She's not that young anymore, she's 20. Smith chuckled and flicked the ash off his cigarette. "I've watched her grow up, she's still a child in my eyes. We used to think she was your little adopted daughter." "Nonsense. But Vivian is quite pretty, you don't have any ulterior motives?" I watched Smith through the lush foliage. He was silent for a few seconds, then shook his head lightly. "No." "All right, as long as it's true. But Peter really likes Vivian." "Any objections if he pursues her?" Smith smirked. "Only if he can catch up." "That's not easy to say." I treaded lightly and quietly left the garden. There were several messages on my phone that I originally had no intention of replying to. I knew all along that Peter was only pursuing me as part of a bet with his friends. But now, I suddenly changed my mind. "Sorry, just saw your message. Are you coming to pick me up now?" As Peter arrived in his flashy sports car, I had just gone upstairs to change into a new skirt. It was slightly revealing, with the hem sitting 10 centimeters above my knees. I had also put on a pair of high heels I had never worn before and did my makeup. When Smith heard the commotion and came over, he only glanced at me, his expression turning dark. "Vivian, go back to your room." Peter cautiously tried to smile as he said, "Smith, I'm here to take Vivian to the movies." Smith gave him a cold look and said, "Get out." "Uncle." I walked up to Peter and linked my arms with him. "We had plans to go see a movie, could you please not interfere with us?" Peter seemed to tremble. Smith smirked, his gaze icy as it landed on my hand. Then, he spoke gently. "Vivian, go back to your room now, don't make me say it a third time." I had just walked into the bedroom with the door still open when Smith forcefully pushed it from the outside, causing it to slam loudly against the wall. Terrified, I paled, wanting to run out. Smith, with a cold expression, closed the door and locked it from inside. He then pushed me against the door, trapping me. As I tried to resist, a slightly heavier slap landed on my hip. The wine-red skirt rippled. Under the thin fabric, the small area of skin felt both painful and hot. "What gives you the right to hit me? I've grown up, I'm not a child, I have the right to make friends." I cried and struggled to push him away. With a firm grip on my wrist, Smith pinned it above my head. I sobbed, my voice getting louder. "Smith, you bastard, beast," I was right to curse at him. With one hand pressing me, the other hand slowly unbuttoned his shirt, smoothly pulling it out from under his shirt. He then undid his belt buckle. I involuntarily tensed up. "Vivian, I am indeed a bastard, a beast." Smith pressed himself against me from behind, lowering his head to kiss my neck and lightly bite. He had evil thoughts towards the girl he had raised from a young age and committed a terrible act. Naturally, he was a beast. No, perhaps he was even worse than a beast. That's why he repeatedly had these impure thoughts, never to be forgiven. Smith wiped away my tears from the corner of my eye, his voice slightly hoarse. "Vivian, 5 days, will the wound heal? No. Let go of me, Smith." I turned my face away, trying to avoid his intimacy. Smith suddenly exerted force. My body pressed tightly against his, seamless, as if fitted together. "No? Let me check." "I don't want you to check, Vivian, don't avoid the issue." Smith could switch so shamelessly to a serious, gentlemanly look. It made me feel morally inferior. "I am not avoiding the issue. It's your medical skills that are lacking." "No, not just your medical skills, your techniques are also lacking." "My techniques are lacking?" Smith raised an eyebrow and looked at me with a lowered gaze. "If I remember correctly, it was you who wouldn't let me go out. That was just a normal physiological reaction." "Very well." Smith looked at me expressionlessly. Lowering his gaze, he rolled up his sleeves, then he firmly grabbed my waist. Pressing me against the door again. The twilight at the villa always looked particularly beautiful. Especially in the early summer evenings. The well-arranged gardens, with lush green foliage. It seemed like a highly saturated watercolor painting. On the terrace not far away, the sheer floor-to-ceiling curtains were only half drawn. The shadows were cast obliquely, painted on the light gauze. As the gentle breeze blew, the shadows swayed. The fragmented murmurs and pleas throughout the room seemed to have been gently shattered with great force. Smith placed his palm between my back and the door panel. I was leaning against his shoulder, and when I looked up, I saw the overlapping figures reflected in the mirror not far away. The man's tall and slender figure, with broad shoulders and neat clothing. Completely shielding me in his arms. Down on the carpet, the bright red dress was scattered in a mess, interspersed with a few small pieces of snowy white fabric. I only glanced at it before turning my head away. Smith brushed the disheveled hair on my sweaty forehead. "Vivian, do you want me to leave?" His voice husky, with desire lingering in his eyes. Yet, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. I had never noticed the sight of Smith, so composed and with such a wicked sense of humor, as well as this level of grudge. I suppressed the palpitations. Arching an eyebrow, I gave him a side glance, bit my lip, and pushed his chest firmly. Smith's eyes darkened. "Vivian?" I ignored him, pushing him forcefully outwards. Seemingly irritated, Smith gritted his teeth. Abruptly, he grabbed my wrist and in the next moment, pushed forward even deeper. Unprepared, I suddenly felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. It seemed like countless white lights were flashing before my eyes. "Smith." I grabbed his arm tightly, feeling both ashamed and angry as tears welled up in my eyes. In the garden, the pond with the fountain was shimmering in the sunset. Workers and gardeners were busy watering the flowers, plants, and trees. Smith leaned down to kiss me, letting out a reluctant smile. It turned out it wasn't Vivian, but a small whale that spouted water. Since that day, I refused to acknowledge Smith. He had been busy these days. Sometimes when we met at home, I treated him as if he were invisible. Twice he seemed to pass by my school and messaged me to have dinner together. But I didn't reply. Under my deliberate avoidance, Smith and I hadn't seen each other for almost half a month. It wasn't until the monthly, unshakable family gathering of the Smiths that I, as the Smiths' half-adopted daughter, couldn't be absent. The reason why I was a half-adopted daughter is quite a drama. When I was 5, Smith's older brother and sister-in-law couldn't have children, so they adopted me. But when I was 7, his sister-in-law suddenly became pregnant and gave birth to a pair of twins. Consequently, they considered giving me up for adoption and sending me back to the welfare home. At that time, Smith was only 15. It was his words that allowed me to stay. I continued to live with the Smiths, enjoying the most privileged life and receiving the best education. However, my status in the Smiths family was somewhat awkward. Initially, I was the adopted daughter of Smith's older brother, so I called Smith Uncle Smith. Later, they didn't want me anymore, but Smith didn't make me change how I addressed him. That name stuck from when I was 5 until I was 20. There wasn't a second person in the world who knew. I didn't want to call him uncle. I liked him. I wanted to marry him. Even as I grew to 16 or 17, many elders in the Smiths subtly hinted to me, asking me to understand my true identity. Just because Smith kindly kept me by his side doesn't mean improper thoughts should arise that the Smiths and Smith are my benefactors. As their adopted daughter, ingratitude was not an option. This gathering was not much different from previous ones. Smith's older brother and sister-in-law still treated me with indifference. The other elders of the Smiths were merely polite on the surface. The twins always seemed to harbor some hostility towards me. I overheard the servants discussing privately. They were probably wary that I was once their nominal sister, afraid of potential inheritance splitting. As usual, I tried to sit in an inconspicuous position. While others chatted and laughed, I simply bowed my head and ate fruits and snacks. Smith arrived a little late. But as soon as he appeared, the atmosphere in the Smith household became lively. Mrs. Smith pretended to be slightly upset. "Why are you so late?" making all the elders in the room wait for you. Smith maintained his usual indifferent tone. There was a sudden surgery at the hospital, which delayed me for a while. He took a seat, right across from me. He took off his glasses and rubbed his forehead wearily. While Mrs. Smith was busy arranging for a refreshing tea to be brought in by the servant, she couldn't help but express her concern. "This is all too exhausting. You've lost some weight." I stole a glance at Smith. He did seem a bit tired. Sitting there with slightly drooping eyes, his face devoid of any emotion. The creases on his double eyelids were deeper than usual. And there was a hint of dark circles under his eyes. In a few months, Smith would be turning 29. Smith's aunt suddenly spoke up. "This marriage really can't be delayed any longer." She then asked Mrs. Smith, "Have you found a suitable match?" Mrs. Smith shook her head and sighed. "Smith always says he's too busy with work, not in a hurry." But no matter how busy, marriage is also a major event in life, of utmost importance. In fact, it's the same topic every year. Because of Smith's reluctance to marry, it had become a source of worry for Mrs. Smith. "Smith, look at your friends around you. No matter how wild they used to be, they all obediently got married before 30. Mrs. Smith advised earnestly. But as she continued speaking, her expression suddenly changed. "Smith, how did you injure your neck?" My heart skipped a beat, and the delicate golden fork in my hand clattered onto the silver plate. The few people sitting close to me all looked in my direction. Smith also gave me a faint glance, and nonchalantly said, "A mosquito bit me, that's all." How careless of me. Mrs. Smith was half in disbelief. However, Smith's aunt chuckled and said, "Why comfort a 3-year-old? Clearly that's a bite mark from a woman. Do you have a girlfriend, Smith?" Mrs. Smith's expression suddenly became serious. "I don't care who it is, but if you are involved with someone, you better end it soon. You should be very clear, regarding your marriage. The elders on your grandpa and your dad's side have already settled on a few prospective candidates." Smith simply responded with a non-committal hum. I lowered my eyes, mechanically eating the fruit on my plate. It felt like I hadn't slept for 3 days and nights. My head was throbbing fiercely. I don't know what Smith is thinking. From the first time we had a relationship to today, he has never mentioned what exactly is between us. I have said that marriage is not urgent. Smith slowly spoke, I have my own plans. When I was ready to go back, the car that brought me was nowhere to be seen. Smith's Maybach was parked under the roadside tree outside the old mansion. The driver came to invite me into the car. After a moment of thought, I followed him. The car drove smoothly ahead. When we reached a fork in the road, I suddenly called to the driver, Ning, you can pull over ahead, I'm going back to the school. The driver slowed down but didn't stop. Smith looked at me sideways, stay at home tonight. I need to go back to school. Vivian, listen to me. Why should I listen to you? Uncle Smith, you are just my nominal uncle. I looked at him calmly, lifting my chin slightly. But what he didn't know was that I was biting my lip tightly at that moment. My hands behind me were clenched tightly. My nails almost piercing the flesh of my palms, yet I couldn't feel any pain. My heart felt like it was being roasted by a blazing fire. Restless, anxious, and desperate, I didn't know what lay ahead. Smith was like a deep pool of water. I exerted all my efforts, yet he seemed unbothered. I have to go on a business trip tomorrow. This time it will be long, I won't be back for almost a month. But my birthday is approaching. Suddenly, Smith grabbed my wrist and pulled me into his arms. I will definitely come back for your birthday. When I came out of the shower, Smith was sitting on the small sofa at the head of my bed, playing with a small ornament. Do you like it? He handed me the item. A man who was always calm and collected had a mischievous glint in his eyes at that moment. I reached out in confusion and took it. After just one look, I blushed and threw it onto the carpet. It was an acrylic ornament of a whale. What's even more absurd was that it was a little whale spouting water. Smith chuckled with delight. He undid his robe belt, leaned over, and pressed me down on the bed. Vivian, his eyes were indifferent. In the 10+ years that I have known him, I rarely saw him display his emotions openly. Even during his proud and arrogant teenage years, he always carried a different kind of seriousness and aloofness. He hadn't had any colorful love stories, no women he admired. It seemed like he had no interest in love and desire. But now, after being tainted by desire, it was as if all his past seriousness and restraint had disappeared. I raised my arm and gently encircled him. Smith, actually, I know that for a person like him, with his background, everything in life has been rigorously arranged from the moment of birth. I also know that people of the Smiths are wary of me. But no one really takes me seriously. In their minds, even if Smith and I have something going on, it's just a fling. But I don't see it that way. I don't think of myself as lowly. Why have you been angry these days? Smith lowered his head and planted a few gentle kisses on my face. The last kiss landed on my lips, softly brushing against them. Don't you know? How would I know if you don't tell me? That bite mark on your neck, your mother may have already thought of something. I will handle it, you don't need to worry about it. Smith touched my temple. Am I going to let you be bullied? His words sounded somewhat indulgent. But I felt inexplicably uncomfortable. I pushed him away, straddled his waist, and said, no one dares to bully me. But the one who has always been bullying me is you. I looked down at the man beneath me. There was a hint of desire in his eyes, but beneath that desire, there was still a distant indifference to he is just in lust. Not in love. My eyes stung, and my heart ached sharply. There were many things I wanted to ask. But when people are young, they always feel like they've lost if they ask first. Smith leaned back against the headboard and looked at me. There was a faint mark left by his glasses on his prominent nose. I leaned down and gently touched it. Then I kissed the mole at the corner of his eye. Smith, tonight I want to tease you too. Just like that night you teased me. In fact, I have no experience at all. In the few times we've been together, Smith has always been the dominant one. But I learned to dance for a few years when I was young. Ballet, Latin, ballroom, etc., although I wasn't particularly good at it. But I was convincing enough to fool a novice. As a result, after the initial awkwardness, I quickly mastered the art of taking control. And gradually, I became adept at playing the game. The desire in Smith's eyes grew deeper and more intense. I watched as he was completely consumed by lust. All restraint, coldness, all disappeared. Vivian, he hoarsely called my name. His hot hands gripped my waist tightly, trying to regain control. But then, I suddenly stopped. In that moment, when he looked at me in confusion, I bent down and whispered into his ear, "Smith, are you comfortable?" His breath seemed to suddenly stop. His already tense body stiffened even more like stone. Vivian, Smith's voice, grew even huskier. "Don't stop. Keep going." But I sat up straight, looking down at him. "Smith, why should I listen to you?" "Vivian," I curled my lips and said, "Smith, I only listen to my husband's words." Later on, I couldn't remember at all how many times I was forced to call him husband. I don't know if Smith liked me calling him that way, or if he just found it exciting. In any case, he seemed to enjoy it very much. Even the next morning, before he left for a business trip, he woke me up while I was still half asleep. "Vivian, I was too tired, being woken up from my sleep." Unconsciously, I raised my hand and softly slapped Smith's cheek. "Vivian." There was a hint of annoyance in the man's voice. Smith stood by the bed in his suit. My hair was messy, my nightgown wrinkled around my waist, and my eyes were still drowsy. "Vivian, I'm leaving for the airport soon. Come on, call me husband one more time." On the third day of Smith's business trip, which happened to be a weekend, Mrs. Smith suddenly came to visit. She had an unusually pleased expression on her face, and when she saw me, she was unusually friendly. Grabbing my hand. "Every time I see you, I feel like you've become even more beautiful." Mrs. Smith patted my hand and pulled me into the living room. "This time I came to see you, it's about something very important. It's also your Uncle Smith's idea." I was somewhat confused, but deep down, I felt a vague sense of unease. Mrs. Smith sat me down, joyfully took out her phone from her handbag, and showed me a photo. "Look, isn't she beautiful?" The woman in the photo was very young and graceful. Her eyes and brows looked especially gentle, exuding a traditional ladylike elegance that made one feel instantly close to her. She was indeed beautiful, instantly likable. Mrs. Smith's smile deepened at my response. "I think so too. I used to think Smith was too boring, and I wanted to find a more lively girl for him. But who would have thought that Smith's type would be this kind?" Mrs. Smith's smile widened. "This is the fiancé chosen by your Uncle Smith." I sat there stiffly, my smile about to freeze at the corners of my lips and eyes. Mrs. Smith continued, "Your Uncle Smith specifically said that he chose Miss White because he likes her and because she has a gentle and kind nature. You don't have to worry that she will bully you in the future." I suddenly looked up at Mrs. Smith. "Did Uncle Smith say this?" "Of course," Mrs. Smith replied without hesitation. "After all, you are someone Smith has seen grow up. Although he doesn't say it out loud, he really cares about you." I seemed to suddenly understand that night when Smith said, "Am I going to let you be bullied?" So, his solution was to find a wife he thought was gentle and kind. And then, marry her. "Vivian, this is a big celebration for our family." The Smiths. Miss White was very beautiful and matched Uncle Smith perfectly. I took one last look at Miss White in the photo. She was truly a remarkably gentle and lovely girl. "Congratulations to Uncle Smith," I smiled and blessed. Mrs. Smith was very pleased, laughing even more openly. "The wedding preparations should start. There may be many things you need to help with, so you can't refuse when the time comes." I nodded in agreement. Mrs. Smith talked to me for a while about how beautiful and gentle Miss White was. Everyone in the upper circles of Denver practically knew her. Miss White from the Whites family was known to be a very obedient and good girl. I watched Mrs. Smith's car drive away. I stood alone in the twilight garden for a long time. I did not resent others. I just felt a bit envious. If I had Miss White's background, then liking Smith would be much simpler, wouldn't it? Smith was about to finish his business trip. I had already applied to study abroad. But I hadn't told anyone about this, including anyone from the Smiths. They were quite busy at that time. There were rumors spreading. The young master of the Smiths was finally going to get married. I continued my usual routine of going to and from classes without any changes. Peter later tried to secretly make plans with me a few times. I decided to confront him. "I knew from the beginning that you were only pursuing me because of bets with your friends." Peter was puzzled for a moment, then looked a bit embarrassed. "Vivian, you knew all along, huh?" "Yes, with all the trivial things your group does every day, it was easy for me to find out." Peter chuckled and scratched his head. "But Vivian, although it started as a bet, I think I really started to like you." When you walked over in that red dress and held my arm, I felt something stir in my heart. Stop. I glanced at Peter. I was just acting, don't get carried away. Vivian, can I seriously pursue you now? No. Why not? Because I have someone I like. Peter immediately got upset. Who the heck is it? I'm not telling you. Anyway, I have someone I like. I don't like you, so don't come looking for me again. Vivian, can I at least compete with him fairly? No. Why not, Vivian? There's not always a reason for everything. Liking someone isn't about who's first in line. It's not fair either. Because people's hearts are naturally biased, especially when facing the person they like. But liking someone is really exhausting. This time, it was my last chance to give to Smith. Also, my last chance for myself. I had a clear conscience and didn't want any regrets. If it didn't end well, I could accept it with resignation and let it go completely. As Smith was finishing his business trip and preparing to return home, all my preparations for studying abroad were almost completed. The scheduled day was the day after my 21st birthday. Since the first year I arrived at the Smiths, every birthday of mine was spent with Smith. This time, I still wanted to be with him. The night before Smith returned home, I couldn't sleep well. At 1 a.m., I still couldn't fall asleep. So, I got up and decided to go downstairs to the kitchen to heat up a glass of milk. However, the bedroom door suddenly opened before I could turn on the light. Only the moonlight shone through the thin curtains, illuminating half of the room. Smith's tall and slender figure looked even more prominent in the dark night. I was a bit absent-minded, staring at him blankly. For a moment, I couldn't tell if this was reality or a dream. Wasn't he supposed to come back tomorrow night? There were still some forms on my desk, and documents scattered around, not yet tidied up properly. Fortunately, my luggage had been transported to the school dormitory in batches. My mind was in a mess, like a tangle of yarn. It wasn't until Smith spoke. Not asleep yet? Uncle Smith. How come you're back early? Smith didn't answer, and it took a while for him to speak. Call me husband in bed, call me uncle under the bed. Playing with me, Vivian? I felt a bit wronged, but didn't want to reveal my concerns in front of him. I wanted him to be flustered, uneasy, anxious, restless, and conflicted. I wanted him to be preoccupied and emotionally stirred. Did I shout the wrong thing? I got out of bed and stood casually at the desk. I discreetly blocked the things on the desk. From childhood to adulthood, haven't I always called you Uncle Smith? I smiled, and even my expression was more indifferent than his. Smith didn't speak, just silently looking at me. After about half a minute, he walked up to me and handed me a small box. Happy birthday. My eyes felt a bit sore, but I didn't reach out to take it. It's not my birthday yet. Smith pushed the box into my hand. There's another gift on your birthday. The jewel box in the palm of my hand wasn't big. If it was jewelry inside, it could only be a small piece like a ring. On your birthday, we'll open it together. Smith touched the top of my head, lightly kissed my forehead, and said, Go to sleep, good night, Vivian. As soon as Smith left my bedroom, I opened the box. But the gift inside disappointed me. It wasn't the ring I had hoped for, it was just a necklace. Somehow, I thought of that gentle and beautiful Miss White again. In my mind, I kept replaying the scene of her standing next to Smith. In fact, Mrs. Smith made it very clear that day. She was the fiancée chosen by Smith himself. How could he not like her? I didn't even wait to finish my birthday. The day before my birthday, I left school directly and went to the airport. It wasn't long before I went to school abroad. Suddenly, Peter also came to this country. I was skeptical about him being able to study abroad. Peter was quite frank about it, saying, I'm self-financed, just coming out to make some money. It's a world of difference from someone like you who got into it on your own. Vivian, we can still be friends, right? I rejected expressionlessly. Peter, there is absolutely no pure friendship between men and women. Either there are hidden intentions, or one party has ulterior motives. Peter was a little embarrassed. Yes, I have ulterior motives. Don't disturb my studies. Can we grab a meal occasionally? Just as I was about to refuse, Peter looked mischievous and said, I have so much gossip but can't find anyone to tell. I'm dying to tell someone, please, Vivian. I was familiar with the male and female protagonists of Peter's gossip. The male lead was Smith. However, the female lead was carefully protected by Smith, causing a stir in the whole Smith's family. As he didn't leak a single bit of information. Peter was very impressed by this. Smith is just incredible. With that face of his grandfather, I feel intimidated just looking at it. He managed to handle it. I wonder who that woman is that made Smith determined to marry her. He even played a trick to switch people. Peter was excited. Originally Miss White was one of Smith's possible fiancées. I don't know how he did it, but now she's the fiancée of his cousin. Even more bizarre, the Whites are willing, Miss White is willing. And your other uncle seems willing too. You mean Leo Smith? Seeing Peter nod, I couldn't help but furrow my brow slightly. Leo and Smith have quite different personalities. As far as I know, Leo hasn't been without a girlfriend over the years. In Denver's social circle, although he's not the biggest playboy, he's quite a well-known ladies' man. Why would Miss White agree? Leo has never been without a girlfriend. I remember every one of his girlfriends is stunningly beautiful. I was also very puzzled at first, but when their engagement was announced, rumors began to spread. It is said that Miss White and your seventh uncle went to the same school since kindergarten. They grew up together. She has been secretly in love with your seventh uncle all these years. That's why she agreed to the marriage between the two families. What about Leo? Does he like Miss White? Peter thought for a while before saying, I heard he just got married abroad not long ago, his first love. So this is the main reason he agreed to the marriage. I didn't know what to say for a moment. Matters of the heart have nothing to do with others. I am not Miss White. I don't know if she is happy or fulfilling her desires or more anxious and fearful. But maybe in a way, she and I are similar. We both want to try our best for the person we like, to fight for it once, without regrets. But Vivian, who do you think Smith likes? My brother and I are so eager to know. We have gone through all the eligible young ladies in Denver, but we just can't pinpoint who it is. Peter said this, then suddenly widened his eyes and looked at me. Oh my, we seem to have overlooked you. My heart skipped a beat, and I was just thinking about how to dodge the question. Peter then said, but he is your uncle after all, he shouldn't be that beastly, right? I suddenly felt a bit guilty and couldn't look Peter in the eye, so my gaze fell onto the whale toy on the desk. In the end, I still picked it up and took it with me when I went abroad. What are you looking at? All spaced out, Peter followed my gaze and also saw the whale toy spouting water. He reached out and picked it up, saying, it's so cute, Vivian, can you give it to me? I jumped up, snatched it back, my face turning red with embarrassment. No, you go on now, I need to study. I said no, that's it, why are you getting worked up? I pushed Peter out, still a bit puzzled. You are really stingy, Vivian. I held the little whale toy tightly. Then I remembered the day when Smith's shirt and pants were all wet because of me. I covered my face, jumped on the bed, and covered my face tightly with a pillow. Smith stood in the study of the Smiths' old house. In front of him were three elders. One was his grandpa, the most authoritative figure of the Smiths. The other two were his parents, who had high expectations for him and strict control over him. For over 20 years, he had always held himself to the highest standards. He had become the pride of his parents, elders, and the Smiths, but not of Smith himself. So this time, he didn't want to retreat anymore. During this period, he had made a lot of preparations. He had thought about every possible scenario and found solutions and escape routes. And then he had kept it a secret from her. He wanted to publicly reveal their relationship on her 21st birthday and propose to her. After that, they would officially get engaged, married, and build their own little family. But Vivian quietly went abroad to study. He didn't even know when she had made these decisions, when she had this idea, when she had grown up silently and become independent and strong. That he was proud of her, but also a little lost. She was no longer the girl who would timidly hide behind him and hold onto his sleeve. Unconsciously, her every move and action now dictated his emotions, whether joy or anger. Like that last night they were together when she said she wanted to tease him. She had already taken control. Smith thought to himself, that woman is Vivian, right? Mrs. Smith sat there, looking like she had aged 10 years. She sighed. Actually, at that family dinner that night, when I asked about the wounds on your neck, your aunt said they were caused by a woman's bite. At that moment, Vivian's name flashed in my mind. But perhaps I didn't want to believe it, so I ignored it. Mrs. Smith sighed again. I should have been more cautious earlier on. Smith looked at her and said calmly, matters of the heart depend on fate. What is meant to happen will happen. When she was 5 years old, I chose her together with my eldest brother and sister-in-law at the orphanage. When she was 7, everyone said not to keep her, and to send her to a better orphanage wouldn't be unfair to her. But I insisted on keeping her at the Smiths, by my side. So if we must blame someone, it can only be fate. Because from the beginning, it was destined by fate. Tears fell from Mrs. Smith's eyes. She understood her own son. The person he chose would not change. If she continued to stubbornly obstruct, it would only hurt the bond between mother and son. But she really couldn't approve of the choice for her daughter-in-law. She had to find a consolation, probably that the girl was someone she had known since she was little. With a clean background, a beautiful appearance, and intelligent and hardworking. There's something else I need to confess to you all. Smith took a step forward, looking at the 3 elders, and slowly began to speak. I had desired her long ago. It was my improper thoughts towards her first. When she turned 18 and had her coming-of-age ceremony, I had too much to drink and bullied her. Mrs. Smith stood up abruptly. Smith! How could you do such a thing? Vivian is only 18. She's still just a child. Mrs. Smith couldn't believe it. Her son, who was as noble as the moon in the sky, had such a disgraceful side. Yes, she had just turned 18, just became an adult. So, it was despicable of me. I committed the wrong. If Vivian had been abused and gone to the police to accuse me of rape, I would have been the one ruined. But she's too kind and chose to forgive. So, grandfather, mom, dad, I owe Vivian. She did not climb up to me. I hope that in the future, if she marries into the Smiths, you all can treat her well. To repay her for saving the reputation of your proud son. Treat her better. Mrs. Smith couldn't help but cry again. Grandfather looked at Smith meaningfully. All right, things have come to this, there's no use in saying anything. The girl has followed you with a clear conscience. We at the Smiths cannot stoop to such beastly acts. Get ready, prepare for the wedding. Smith thanked his grandfather and left the study, finally letting out a long sigh. He deliberately portrayed Vivian as the victim, mentioning her age as 18 instead of 20 to make the Smiths feel guilty about their treatment towards her. He knew that the Smiths were not pleased with Vivian as their daughter-in-law. Their attitude towards Vivian over the years was clear to him, just polite on the surface, but deep down looking down on her. He didn't want Vivian to face their condescending looks and mistreatment once she entered the household. As for what the elders would think of his unworthy behavior, Smith didn't care about his perfect image collapsing in their minds. Now, he missed Vivian. No, it should be said he missed the little whale that could spout water. When it was in Smith's home, it had the ability to sneak into his room in the middle of the night. Even though now abroad in the apartment I rented, Smith managed to show up precisely at my doorstep. Then, as I was about to turn off the lights and sleep, he knocked on the door, nearly scaring me out of my wits. Of course, I opened the door for him since the news of Fu Jingji's engagement to Leo had already spread. Smith was just too handsome, and he didn't like Miss White, let alone the fact that the female lead of the story had always been me. Naturally, I was happy. I opened the door and let him in. Smith remained silent, merely leaning against the door and looking at me. Initially, I maintained eye contact, but gradually, I started feeling embarrassed under his gaze. What are you doing, Smith? I glared at him and was about to turn away. But suddenly, I saw the little whale on the desk, and instantly, my entire demeanor changed. Smith noticed it too. In the dim room, he couldn't help but let out a joyful laugh. Then his tall figure approached me, and he hugged me from behind. Little whale? Smith. My neck heated up instantly, almost fainting from the mix of embarrassment and indignation. His kiss landed on my ear. Why so annoyed? You look beautiful. You were saying. I resisted his attempts to kiss me, trying to squirm out of his hold. But Smith didn't insist, raising an eyebrow and looking at me with a smile. If you won't let me speak, you can at least call me husband, and I won't say a word. No, really don't want to? Smith teased. Vivian, I didn't bring a change of clothes this time. If it gets wet, honey. I lifted my hand to cover my face, closed my eyes, and softly called out. Smith's arm holding mine tightened slightly. But in the next moment, he embraced me even tighter. Vivian, he said, bowing his head so our foreheads lightly touched. I'm sorry, I should have told you earlier. Told me what? Smith held me close to his chest, so I couldn't see the hint of a smile in his eyes. But suddenly, my finger felt something cold. I looked down and saw a diamond ring. I wanted to tell you that I liked you even earlier than you liked me. I wanted to propose on your birthday. Perhaps Vivian would never know. In fact, that night he wasn't really drunk at all. If it wasn't for her, if it wasn't for the person he loved, why would he have lost control under the influence of alcohol? And from the beginning, he knew. Vivian wasn't drunk either. She might have forgotten, on the year of her 18th birthday. It was the first time she drank, and she had a lot but didn't get drunk. And that night, she was only halfway through the amount she drank when she seemed intoxicated. But he would never reveal it. It was his sweetest little secret hidden deep in his heart.